Dorothy and Kirsty Ritchie from Mind and Mission today. So Kirsty and our business partner have just been successful in securing some funding for Suicide Prevention Scotland, and Kirsty will talk a wee bit more about that today as well. So over to Kirsty and Dorothy, and before we start, Kirsty's just going to say a wee bit about safeguarding as well. Thank you both.
Thanks, Lindsay. Great to be here today. It's my pleasure. The topic today is not one that we would necessarily wake up feeling excited to discuss. I think we just need to acknowledge that first off. We've only just got our heads around talking about mental health in the workplace, and now we're sort of introducing the suicide risk topic as well. So I just wanted to take 1 minute just to talk about safeguarding. It is a difficult subject for some, for many. You may have been touched by suicide in the past. It may be something that has been in your world. And just wanted to let you know that if you are triggered in any way through anything that we discussed today on the webinar, that you can contact me. I'm a trained psychotherapist, and I will be happy to have a conversation with you after the session today. So please feel free to do that, and I'll share my details with you.
Thank you for that, Kirsty, very much. It's lovely to have Kirsty here. I know a number of us in the McKinney HR team have had conversations with Kirsty over this past good few months, and our expertise and knowledge in this area, we just couldn't resist bringing it into our field in terms of the impact in the workplace and just the responsibilities and lots of things to talk about today. We were chatting earlier about what we'd cover, and we decided we had no difficulty filling this hour and more. So we will hopefully focus on the things that are important to you and us. So first thing I'm going to do is I'll hand over to Kirsty for this. She's going to go through some of the figures with us and some background, just to position us on just where we are just now. Everybody seeing that? Yep.
So you can see there just a few statistics, and I know I'm an ex-accountant, but I'm not going to start going through trillions of numbers with you and boring you with that. Just really to point out and to set the scene for our conversation today, is like mental health, the suicide still to some degree, and some would say to a large degree, is considered a taboo subject. Suicide was illegal in most of the UK, not in Scotland, but in most of the UK until the 1960s. It was seen as, and I can't even believe they used this term, it was seen as self-murder, which when I hear that now, it kind of gives me a bit of a chill, that phrase in itself. So up until the 1960s, you could be sent to prison for attempting suicide. And I think there was some statistic, there's about 5,000 cases in the late 50s. 600 of these were prosecuted, and 33 people were sent to prison for attempting suicide. I think it was 1961 before it was actually decriminalised in England and Wales. So, you know, that's still some of our generation and our sort of parents' generation. So the situation today, in terms of the numbers, it's not that different. In Scotland today, 2 people take their own life every day, but that's not all. Some researchers believe that for each person that does complete suicide, 20 will attempt it. So that number then jumps to over 14,000 attempts each year in Scotland, and that starts to get a little bit of a scary number. And some also suggest, and this number can't be verified because in the UK we don't specifically collect statistics, some researchers suggest that at least 10% of all suicides are work-related. And that's why we're here today, isn't it, to talk about that impact in the workplace. So in Scotland, that's 3 or 4 people every day in Scotland attempting suicide due to work-related issues. Just last month, I know it wasn't Scotland, but that case of the head teacher, Ruth Perry, who died by suicide triggered by work, wasn't it? I'm sure there'll be an inquest, and I would certainly imagine that it will be considered a work-related suicide. Compare that to France. The burden of proof in terms of any suicide that occurs in the workplace, the burden of proof is on the employer to prove that that suicide is not work-related. And even in cases where the suicide is outside of work, it's still investigated as work-related if there's proof of a causal link there to work. So their statistics say that around 1 in 5 employees that suicide through employees are reported, they are officially recognised as being work-related. So that's 1 in 5. So if we translated that into Scotland's numbers, the case of attempted suicides that were work-related could be as high as 7 or 8 per day. So all of that getting to the point of we are potentially seeing 7 or 8 people attempting to take their own life every day through work-related circumstances. We had a new client just in the last couple of weeks who asked us to provide some counselling to a staff member, and before we knew it, we had 3 staff members. 2 out of those 3 staff members expressed suicidal thoughts. If you don't know it's happening, you have to assume that it is. And when you start to build up that picture, it's quite eye-opening. And I guess, you know, we could almost stop the webinar right there and it would be hard-hitting enough. But we have more. Dorothy and I think we've got a few different areas to debate, haven't we?
We have. Yeah, those figures are extraordinary, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
It really brings home just all of our responsibilities, isn't it? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other things as well, one of the other areas is that they tell us that the researchers tell us that for every suicide, there is around 140 people impacted. So whether that's work, home life, whether it's school, whatever that might be, there's around 140 people impacted by every suicide. So it is scary stuff. It is scary stuff, but there's also really simple things that we can do as well.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier about, I mean, it's just mind-blowing, isn't it? Because it's something we don't talk about. So it is so good to talk about it here. Absolutely. And you know, just thinking straight away in terms of the workplace, there's the manager, there's the colleagues, HR, occupational health, family, and so that, and how wide that goes. And you're 140, absolutely impacting on the workplace.
Yeah.
And just thinking, you know, we talk about, you know, as you know, we do a lot of workplace investigations, and for the more serious ones, we will come into a business and someone have been suspended.
Mm-hmm.
And there is such a variety of levels of support for people who are suspended. What we see is some are just left at home to do nothing but think about it. And whether the person, and others where they put in some support mechanisms, you know, a contact person to update, etc. But it's a horrendously lonely place for people to be.
Yeah.
And whether they did or didn't do whatever the allegations are about, either way, it's extraordinarily stressful, isn't it? And
I think when we consider that, and you know, when we talk about suicide, we can't very specifically when we think about the workplace, we can't avoid thinking about stress.
Yes. And
we can't avoid thinking about what causes stress in the workplace. We need to start somewhere, and stress generally arises from 4 things. And you talked there about, you know, if someone's suspended, or, you know, circumstances where there may or may not be support for an individual. And I had an example, this is way back now, about 15 years ago. I managed a team of 30 people, and I had one individual who had been struggling, and what we decided was to ask this individual to take time off. It's unusual. It's not something that you would normally do, but it was very clear that this individual was struggling with their mental health. And I was asked as their line manager to then later on visit them at home and discuss returning to work, which seemed like a fairly simple ask. When you're the line manager, you know how to do all these things. Little did I know that this individual had spent a week in hospital on suicide watch. And there was I, knocking on the door, and I learned this when I visited. Needless to say, I did not ask that individual about returning to work. It was entirely inappropriate. But I think sometimes these things, it's only on reflection that you can actually realise I had no training, I had no understanding of what to do in this circumstance at all. So I flipped from Kirsty line manager to Kirsty human being, and I sat and I listened and I tried to understand, and through that conversation we did get that individual back to work. But I was very struck at that moment, and even more so now when I reflect on that, the lack of understanding in the workplace of that situation. And you talk about that isolation, and that individual was utterly alone. And what we could have done for them, we didn't, because as an organisation and as an individual and a line manager, it sounds terrible. We didn't know. We didn't know this situation was happening, and we didn't know what to do. Absolutely. Which is possibly even worse. So when I come back to talking about stress.
Yes, absolutely. We'll come back to that one. Let's keep remembering it. And because I'm just remembering, I've started this on thinking about investigations and things. But we've been involved as a few years ago now, and anonymised, of course, with a situation. We were doing an investigation, and one person had been sent home to protect her mental health. And when we spoke to her, she said, that's the worst thing they could do to me. I needed to be at work, even if I was just sitting filing papers, rather than sitting at home by myself, wondering about everybody talking about me. What's going to happen? Why did they do this? I've not done anything wrong. And all those questions that we know people will think about. And the workplace thought they were doing the best thing. Absolutely thought they were doing the best thing.
And it's coming from the right place, isn't it? It absolutely comes from the right place. But who are we to know? We meaning we as an organisation. I'm sort of speaking on behalf of all the organisations I've ever worked for, not in an HR perspective. As I said, I was an accountant. It's only now that I've sort of partnered and collaborated with HR. My business partner is an ex-HR director. I'm a lifelong accountant. So just a big but as a line manager and a senior manager, I came up against a lot of HR policy from a different perspective, from a very objective perspective, and who are we to think that we know what is best for that individual? And I only really can say that now with the knowledge and understanding as a therapist, a psychotherapist. At work, we don't ask the question. We don't ask that individual, well, what makes sense for you? What do you need? What do you want out of this situation? How can we help? And that example that I gave there, Dorothy, we did exactly that as an organisation. We sent someone home because their mental health was suffering, thinking, let's call it out with all honesty. We pushed the problem out of the organisation and we put it onto the individual. Crikey, when I look back, it's far from ideal.
Do you want to cover the stress bit just now that we were talking about earlier? Yes, let's get in there.
Jump around. And so I suppose setting up this kind of scenario as well, we're talking about suicide. How do we even sort of get to that space and thinking about that space at work? Well, we think about stress first of all, and stress normally comes from four things. It comes from high demands, it comes from change of circumstances, it comes from uncertainty and loss of control. So those four aspects. And I guess then what that leads to is the one scenario where all of those four things are present, it's work, obviously. And this is where we then start to think about what we call risk factors. And there's lots of different complicated scientific-y sounding words for all of this stuff, but we at Mind and Mission and me, my simple accountant brain, I like to keep it simple. Suicide risk generally is identifiable in three parts. We have triggers and we have what we call motivational factors. So these are the situations, these are the circumstances that people come up against. We've also got demographic risk factors, and then we've got individual specific signs. So those are the three things. So the thing that is related to, in our opinion, stress is these triggers, these motivational factors, the things that are happening to an individual that will create stress, that will create anxiety, that will push people past a tolerable barrier, I guess. So we have to think about what are those four factors: the high demands, change of circumstances, uncertainty, and loss of control from a work perspective. That's our starting point. And clearly, I'm not saying when these four things are present, it leads to suicidal thoughts, but it's the starting point. You know, it's one that we can evaluate. It's one that we can self-regulate to some degree, and to some degree we can manage. Mm-hmm. So from a work perspective, I wondered if it's worth opening it up in the chat and seeing what everyone thinks. Lindsay, I don't know if you're monitoring the chat there, but you know, there's many different things that happen at work that might fit into those four categories. I wonder if it's worth putting those up in the chat. So high demands, change of circumstances, uncertainty, and loss of control is maybe for everyone to think about where, you know, what sort of circumstances or situations at work might fall into those four categories. How many can we think of?
And pop them into the chat.
Pop them into the chat, yeah.
Yeah.
Just while you're thinking of them, I'll give you one. So the obvious one, high demand, isn't it? And we need to think about high workloads, but there's varying levels, isn't there? And what we have to consider with high demands and high workloads is when it gets to a case of unreasonable pressure. Yes. Yeah, when it gets intolerable. And I'll tell you a little story again from my accounting days. So I spent 10 years in a bank, one of the banks that was supported during the global financial crash. And as an accountant, we spent 2 months every year end working nights, working weekends. We had literally no life over that reporting period. And on the Friday that the results were going to be announced, we used to work a 24-hour shift. So I went in on the Thursday morning at 7 a.m. and I didn't leave it until 7 a.m. the next morning, the Friday morning, an all-nighter. And I remember getting up to go home that Friday morning, and I was so tired, and you know, I'm driving home and everything, the risk is just like, and I tripped and I fell and I flat in my face because I was so tired. I tripped over the turn-ups in my trousers and I fell flat on my face. Talk about health and safety. All you HR business partners are going, oh, good grief, the risk. And to make it worse, my boss turned around and said, just take a couple of hours. You don't need to come in till 10 o'clock. And this was 7 in the morning after I'd just done 24 hours. And I just looked at him and is he joking? Is he having a laugh here? And needless to say, I did not go into work that day at all. In complete defiance, he was like the big boss. And I was like, there is no way I'm going into work. that is intolerable demands. Yeah, that is unreasonable pressure. So we need to consider that as well, and that's different for everyone. What's all come up in the chat?
Loads of stuff in the chat. Lindsay, do you want to go through some of those for us?
Yeah, we've got a few came with us. Thanks for all your comments. So Amy Beddoes has said that perhaps a bit specific, but in some mental health organisations, they may send staff home after a client patient suicide, again to protect them, and they are MH, they are
Mental health.
Mental health, but that makes things so much worse.
Yeah.
We've also got I'm sorry for the pronunciation if I get this wrong, Tomic. Co-workers leaving can be a big one, especially if they're not replaced properly. Heather Moss, organisational reviews. Jan McCaig, vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
And also Tomic's also said that especially if they're leaving because of redundancies or other instability.
And it's reminded me, that one's reminded me of, and this is way back in the 80s, and it was in the police, and there was a probationer constable who was going through his probation. He wasn't successful. He'd been given loads and loads of opportunities to improve, but it just wasn't for him. And I still remember the day that my boss, he was a superintendent, HR, well, people, personnel, probably in those days, or something more backward, had sat him down and said, look, I'm really sorry. And, you know, the guy that was doing it was the best person to do it. Loads of empathy, a really superb senior officer. And he made sure the guy was distraught. He came from a family of police officers. This was going to be such an impact on him and the family. The superintendent did everything he could, made sure somebody went home with him, took him home, made sure there was somebody there. And about an hour later, the phone call that he'd gone into the garage and taken his own life. And the distress for all of us, you know, the family, of course, but the questioning that superintendent did, and the amount of time that we spent talking to him, he was in tears. It just was, and a strong police officer who you would depend on out there in a road accident or, you know, a scene that was very chaotic. It was just extraordinary. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll not, you get the shivers when you think about these things. And we've all come across it in some way, haven't we?
Yeah, and we have numerous traumatic events. You know, let's call it what it is, traumatic events at work. It could be something like bullying or harassment. I've gone through that myself. I had to raise a grievance. I ended up with depression. I was off work for 6 months. And I felt treated terribly. I felt like no one was on my side. And again, you know, who knows what that may have led to.
I know.
Redundancy situations, you know, we could talk all day about the impact of, you know, and your example there, Dorothy, the impact of redundancy situations is seriously underestimated. Things like restructuring. When I was in the bank, I think every week there was another restructuring, and when there's a lack of engagement, when there's a lack of conversation, a lack of decent communication, that can be really stressful as well. And any other ones that you want to pick out, Lindsay?
There's one, a really good point made by Gillian. Gillian Battison says grievances raised against other team members, but have to continue still to work with them.
And you know, I'd gone off sick with depression, and you know, I was out of it, but I can only imagine the trauma of having to work with someone that you've raised a grievance again, and more often than not that someone is more senior to you. The other elements, things like not having a clear role structure, or not having control over how your job is carried out. That loss of control is quite a big one as well. And again, a topic we could talk all day about, lack of management support.
Absolutely.
We've covered some of that, haven't we?
And it's really interesting, because when we talk about conflict, and we do the transforming conversation 1 hour thing, and 1 hour thing, it's better than a thing, but yeah. But
yeah.
the areas that we talk about is what causes conflict, and it's those things that you're describing. It's the not understanding their role, not being clear on what's expected of them, not being given support, all of those things which cause stress. And we talk about, it is so critical to look at what individuals need and not assume what they need. And I guess that perhaps brings us to the, when I think of this, and when I hear you talking about it, it's amazing. We're talking about what do you do? Because there's instinct, and that will come from whoever you are as to what you do. If someone, well, I suppose there's a conversation first of all, isn't there? And maybe you maybe can cover that in a wee second. But there's the instinct, then there's a policy, if there is a policy. If there's not a policy, where do you look to? And then there's doing the right thing. And we don't know what the right thing is.
Yeah, you're so right. And I spent a little bit of time thinking about this. What is the solution? Again, I go back to my accountant brain, must find solution. And, you can rack your brain trying to figure out there must be a one size here that we can help people to understand and to implement. I guess where we come from and the work that we've done over the last 6 years with Louise and I, if we think about it, we're not going to debate this, but we know that employers have a legal duty to take care of their employees. That's
Absolutely.
undeniable. They also have a really unique position to support well-being and good mental health, and therefore employers have this hugely important role creating the kind of environment where people can seek help if they are experiencing suicidal thoughts. So you've got, it's sort of twofold here. You've got managing the risks about workplace stress, about preventing unfair treatment. That's going to help to create a mentally healthy workspace, which in turn helps to start to address some of the potential risks associated with suicide. Ultimately, if you treat people badly, they will feel bad. Yeah.
Yes.
That's what leads down the various paths. And then if someone knows that their concerns are going to be listened to with empathy, with understanding, with compassion, that's going to help that person to take the first step in accessing support. It is absolutely, almost like set in stone. Research upon research has told us that a conversation can save a life. Absolutely. We like being very simple here at Mind the Mission. We split it into 4 elements, and it covers almost exactly what you said there, Dorothy. Number 1, understand that this is an issue and it does relate to the workplace. And that's partly why everyone's here today, starting that process. Number 2, educate. What is actually happening? Speak to your people, know the facts around suicide, learn how to have good conversations, and importantly, ask that question. Are you thinking about suicide? Yeah. Number 3, create the appropriate policies and support processes. Yeah, so that is all about addressing the risks, suspected suicide, post-suicide. You have to address the cultural and the religious beliefs or customs, how to manage the awful practicalities, such as removing someone's personal belongings. That in itself, the grief process for staff, that is a huge minefield, a huge one. That's 3. Number 4, be prepared to throw all of those policies out the window.
Yes.
Yeah, a client came to us to ask our advice. An employee had, and this is a devastating story, an employee had lost her husband to suicide. She was 8 months pregnant. And the HR business partner was talking about policies and frameworks and what they could and couldn't do. And Louise said, it was Louise's client, said, stop, take yourself out of policy for a minute. Think about what this individual is going through right now and the risk to their own life that now exists. Throw that policy book away. Think about what makes sense. And this is what you said there, Dorothy, isn't it? What makes sense? Not what you can do through your policy, but what are you prepared to do for this person? I'm getting shivers just thinking about it.
I know.
This person, this human who has just suffered an intolerable situation. But if we do something for one person, it's going to become precedence. and you know, it's that sort of, we've both just done it there, holding our heads. And this is the problem.
Do the right flipping thing.
The mindset is on the policy and not the person. This is life and death.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we can't fit all this neatly into some paragraphs in a policy. So maybe the policy just becomes, we deal with every instance on its own facts.
I know.
And we respond
and
appropriately.
Here's the strategies that we can offer, and here's the support, etc. I know we can come, maybe you and us can come back to that separately, because there's a need out there, isn't there, for a policy, and we are quite happy to draw up template policies on issues like this and just share it with whoever we can throw it at, you know.
And even the example that you've given, a couple of examples that I've given, that's where it goes wrong. We can learn from those instances, you know, based on what happened to those individuals. We know there's examples that we can learn from and think about, well, what would be the right way, what would be the options, what would be the appropriate responses. And then what's that next
Absolutely.
above
so
that?
It feels look that we've got, I'm thinking of, I have to say, I'm thinking of people I know, not in workplaces. So I'm thinking about, and I'm sure if anybody's on Facebook or whatever, they will see from time to time. I know someone who from time to time puts a message on to say, that's it, I'm going, I love you all, or, you know, similar messages to that. And I know one person in particular that did that every couple of months. And the comments that started to come on it were, well, you said that a few months ago. And people then, they started off by going, oh my goodness, how can I help, blah, blah. And then it was, gosh, this is the third time he said he's going to end his life. Meantime, his mother, who sees the post, finds out where he is, calls the police, heads to wherever bridge he's going to jump off, talk him down. And there's such a, you know, it's horrendous. So I guess, well, what do you do now, whether it's a workmate or a friend or whoever who is saying, that's it, I'm going, I don't want to talk to anybody about it, goodbye, I love you all.
Yeah, I suppose it's quite difficult to look at a very specific example without a lot of detail. I mean, essentially, you have to start to think about how you would start a conversation. What does that sound like? The first thing you need to really think about is your own thoughts, your own preconceptions about suicide. You know, have you ever thought, oh, someone who commits suicide is so selfish? So there's two things there. One is the word commit. We don't tend to use that word anymore because it suggests when suicide is illegal that you are then committing a crime.
Goodness, and I still use that word.
So we find other language. Complete suicide, died by suicide, you know, whatever the language that you feel comfortable. And that's the other part. We need to get comfortable with that word. And in our course, we get everyone to say out loud the word suicide. We don't say it, we whisper it, suicide. You know, it's that word, the word that shall not be said kind of thing. And you have to think about your own attitudes. So this, you know, you said there about messages that people always done this before. This is the third time, you know, and obviously there's judgment there. You need to challenge your own beliefs and your own attitudes, how you were maybe brought up in terms of your beliefs around suicide. If we think our parents lived through it's illegal. So, you know, we have to start thinking about those perceptions. There's also religious considerations. We have no right to judge anyone who has a religious belief around suicide, no matter what it is. So number one, understand your own thoughts, preconceptions, suicide. You can do that at any time. And then you have to think about how you're going to start a conversation with someone. Yeah. I would say that word suicide in front of a mirror. Get used to saying the word. When you can say the word out loud, you can ask the question out loud. Yeah. So you could have a number of scenarios. You could have the scenario there where someone is very open, this is what I'm going to do. Or you could have someone who is showing signs and you think, this doesn't look right. You have to be able to ask that question, are you thinking about suicide? So in that example you gave there, it may be, are you thinking about suicide right now? Are you planning suicide right now? The next part, so that's the first part, the hard part. The next part is, well, what's next? If someone says yes, that's a big deal.
And if we take that back into the workplace, in terms of what next, that would be helpful for you to run through with us.
Yeah, I mean, if that was a colleague that I was working beside, me personally, put on the spot, I would say, do you want to come to one of the meeting rooms and we can just have a chat? Yeah, if it was something that someone I knew well, I wouldn't leave them on their own. If they were in a place where they were adamant that they were definitely looking to take their own life that day, your thought process should be, this person is in immediate risk, immediate danger. Yeah, you do not leave that individual on their own. If they are adamant that that is what they're going to do, you phone the police or an ambulance. Yeah, and you get someone help straight away. If the situation is that they are having suicidal thoughts, if you ask that question, are you thinking about suicide? And the answer is yes, but they're what we call passive rather than active thoughts. Active is when someone is intentionally and planning to do that, to complete suicide. Passive is where it's thoughts, but they're not actively looking to do it. Then your conversation is slightly different. And I say conversation, it's about listening. What I will say is there's lots of things that are not going to come across well. One thing I would say is, and again, it's something I grew up with, that you're not thinking about doing something stupid, are you?
Yes.
I've thought that. I haven't said it, but think about how that question would be taken by someone who's finding it difficult to keep living. Once you ask the question, no matter what the answer, you are not there to solve their problem. Yeah, it's not your job, it's not your responsibility, you're not accountable for that person.
And neither do you have the skills for it, absolutely.
Neither do you have the skills for it. Your job is to listen. And if this is in the workplace, you listen. You understand, is there a risk there? Is that person in immediate risk? And as I said, if they're in immediate risk, it's police or it's ambulance. If they're not, you listen. Everything else is out the window. You listen. And I'm going to give you some things to avoid saying. Avoid saying at least. So I'll give you an example. Oh, you had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. Yeah. If you say at least, it's minimizing the pain that they're in. So try to avoid saying, oh, well, at least.
At least.
Yeah.
Wasn't worse, I know.
Avoid guilt. Avoid reasoning with them to change your mind. That sounds like, think about your family. What will they do without you? Yeah, they may be thinking, my family's better off without me. Yeah, so think about that. Don't try to reason with them. That, again, is not your job. Your job is just to listen to their pain and try to understand it. Avoid filling silence. Yeah, and if someone just isn't speaking, you maybe want to say, is it okay if I just sit with you? Yeah, I can see that you're not talking. I don't understand your pain, but is it okay if I just sit with you for as long as it takes? And avoid why. Yeah, we maybe don't understand it, but they don't have to justify it to you, the position that they're in. So you wouldn't say something like, why do you want to take your own life? Because you're asking them to justify their actions or their decision. That's not making them feel better. So that was just a bit of a whistle-stop tour there of things to consider and things to think about, things that we've maybe never even considered thinking about before, and how to start approaching that conversation and think about how someone else is feeling.
That's really, really interesting, Kirsty, really. I'm learning a lot of stuff as we go through this, which is fantastic. We have about 15 minutes. Folks, if you have questions, pop them into the chat, and we'll pick on the ones that, Lindsay will pick on the ones that we feel have perhaps have not answered up to now. That would be really good. I'm thinking of situations where this people have taken their lives. I nearly said committed suicide. I'm going to have to slap my face every time I say
Hard one, yeah.
Isn't it amazing that we just get
Yeah.
into a way of speaking? And the other was a big one that impacted in our workplace at one point, that's even longer ago than the 80s, was the company insurance policy, life insurance, and didn't cover individuals who took their own life.
Wow.
And that was a major issue in terms of, well, there was an assumption that the wife would get insurance from the company, and it just didn't happen. And, you know, there's a limit as to what you can do, isn't it, as an employer?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, and you know, there's other aspects in terms of work related. I know we sort of covered stress, albeit you know briefly, in talking about those factors. If we think about very specific work related factors as well that sort of link in with the demographics, you've got things like in the agriculture or the construction sectors as well. They have access to means. So in agriculture, they may have access to firearms. And both agriculture and construction access to heavy machinery. So they are, you know, form one of the demographics, you know, groups of people where the risk factor is even higher. Serving in the military is another one, and LGBTQ plus is another demographic. Individuals, you know, drug or alcohol users is another demographic. So all of those, while these are specific demographics, can be very work related as well, because they are in our workplaces.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have policies that cover a lot of some of those issues, but not this side of it.
Yeah.
I guess my experience is, because I don't understand and don't know, but I've signed up for your West Lothian course, so hoping I'll learn quite a bit from it. But there is a kind of tension of whose responsibility is it? And when you said earlier, you know, send them home, that'll stop it, the work impacting on them. And that is, when you think about it objectively, it is shifting it. I've sent them home, I've done my bit, and it's nowhere near enough.
Yeah,
or
and
potentially the right thing to do.
I know, and it's about taking a really honest look, and a human approach, and really thinking about both the organisation and the employee together. We're not saying here ignore the risks to the organisation, not at all. No. But we are saying this is a topic that warrants a level of thought beyond other policies and beyond the norm. And maybe it is that you need experts to come in and talk to you about it and think about things that you maybe haven't thought about. I don't know if anyone even considered the sort of things that are really not appropriate to say in that situation. And hopefully, you know, some of the participants here today are thinking, wow, that is maybe things that I would have said. And now starting to educate yourself, things can change. There's a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And there are things that you have said, not to say that I have said, because I didn't know what else to say.
Yeah.
And whatever comes to your mind first. And
yeah,
really interesting too, in terms of, you know, workplaces and managers being open to talking to people. And we talk about this all the time and just everything that we do. And if managers or HR, whoever we are, if we take the approach of not asking people day to day, oh, how are you today? How did that difficult job go yesterday? how's your husband? I heard he had an accident. You know, didn't it? And if there are people, managers, who aren't showing an interest in people around about them, they come into work and just, oh, hi, and away into their office, then if there is something upsetting or worrying or impacting on that individual, they're going to be less likely to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
So it's so important to have that open conversational approach with people, so that if they have any issues, whether it's what we're talking about today or not, they're going to be less likely to talk to you about it.
Absolutely, and it's that never-ending cycle.
Absolutely.
The difficulty is, and I would say the fear stops us from doing stuff. So
yes.
I think the fear essentially comes from this manager's ethos, this leadership ethos that I must find the solution. I must find the solution to this problem. Then when it comes to mental health, suicide risk, all that, it's like, whoa, I'm not equipped to find the solution. No. Therefore, if I ignore it, if I pretend it's not happening, this is all subconsciously going on. I'll just avoid the topic entirely. That's fear doing that, because we don't know what the solution is. Well, the good news is, and the simplicity of all of this is, you don't have to find the solution. So we can just put that completely on one side. You don't need to fix this individual. You just need to listen. It is that simple.
Yes, and I guess, you know, you talked about the responsibility. There is that duty of care, isn't it?
Yeah.
Duty of care and risk. And if as an employer or manager, we have sensed that there's something going on and we ignore it, it's ignore at your peril, really.
Yeah, and we do ignore it. We do ignore it because it's way too, in our brains, again, this fear, we're convincing ourselves it's probably nothing, or it's way too complicated. I don't know what to say, or I might say the wrong thing, you know, but better to say something and say the wrong thing than say nothing.
I know, absolutely.
If you ask someone if they're considering suicide, you are not saying the wrong thing.
No.
Yeah, there is nothing in that conversation that can go badly at the end of the day, because you have shown concern. And if they turn around and say, don't be ridiculous, you just go, okay, I had some concerns because I spotted this or saw that or felt this. I just had a gut feeling that there was something. And you ask the question. There's not much that can go wrong.
There's not, absolutely. And I'm remembering back to accompanying a family member to the doctors, not a close family member, but someone close enough who wanted me to go with them. So I was sitting in with the GP and I sat behind, trying to look like I wasn't there, if you know what I mean. And the doctor chatted, how are you feeling, did all of that stuff. And then in a very conversational way, he said, and are you having suicidal thoughts? And you can imagine me in the background thinking, holy shit. And the person said, yes. Yeah. And I thought, oh my Lord, I'm glad he asked, but what, you know, the way he did it, he built it up. How are you? What are you thinking about? And then just asked the question. And then from there, he talked through potential strategies and ways to support the person that I was with. Yeah. And, you know, it was extraordinary. It was fantastic. You know?
The first time I asked the question, I have to say I was really, really scared. Really scared. And this is as a therapist. This wasn't as a line manager in corporate world. It was really scary, and it was online. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't face to face. I wasn't in the room with the individual, and that adds a whole other layer, because I can't be with that person if the answer to the question is yes, and I am about to. Yes. It has adds a whole other layer. But I asked the question, and the answer was no. And we talked about the things that I'd seen and heard and spotted and observed, and it really opened up that conversation. And I know that Louise, my business partner, has done exactly the same. She's asked it many times now, and when you ask it the first time, it does become easier, because you know that you can cope with the answer. When you have a mindset that I don't have to fix this person, I just have to listen without judgment, and be there.
Yeah. And listen without judgment. I feel in my head I would have the need to signpost
Yeah.
as opposed to just leave it there. So what would the next steps be? I know it's like giving you like 2 minutes to do that.
I
but
know,
just
I
sort of-
know. Signposting is a really tricky one because
Mhm.
signposting can be a little bit perceived as finding a solution.
Right.
That
Okay,
conversation
yep.
and here's what to do.
Mhm.
You know, anyone can have a conversation with us, but again, we have to think about how we word this, our language, because if we turn around to someone and say, have you spoken to your GP?
I know.
You know, and it could be that they've spoken to their GP 30 times and they're not getting the result, you know. So we need to be careful with signposting in what it actually is. It's about thinking through what options does this person have. It may be that the conversation they have with you is enough.
Right.
You may
Yes.
turn around and say, you know, I just feel so much better because you listened right now.
Yep.
And it's not about, have you thought about going to counselling? Have you thought about going to your GP? Speak to your friends or family. What support network do you have? It's about engaging in a conversation that is just human.
Yeah.
And the purpose of a conversation around suicide is to help that individual and understand, is that individual connected with life or are they connected with suicide? And that connection with life is just having a conversation about, you know, their life, what's happening with them. You know, and if they start to talk about their animals that they feed, you know, that I feed the cat and I take my dog out for a walk, that's a connection with life. And that gives you ideas that maybe this person is not in the place where they are about to do something. So it's through the conversation that you understand, where are we? Where does this feel like it's leading to? And then you think about, well, what options are out there in terms of counselling, GP, friends, family, you know, an EAP at work, for example. Then you think about that conversation.
Yeah, that's really, really, really helpful. And I guess one of the things would be, is there anything I can do with it? Is there anything you need? I suppose, is there anything you need from us as an employer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question to ask. And again, the language is important because remembering that as a line manager, you are not personally accountable or responsible for that individual. It could be, you know, what could we do to help? Is there anything that we can do? It could be, how can we work together at work to understand how we support you and how we make things easier for you. So it's a human conversation, isn't it?
It is, with no presumptions or assumptions.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You're not necessarily going into it with this, I've got a goal that I have to fix or I have to resolve, or I've only got 10 minutes for this, you know, conversation, or, you know, it has to be drop everything, 100% focus on a conversation.
Conversation on a human level and a long enough and listening enough to then you will know what happens next, I guess, in some way, because you've engaged with them. Absolutely. Gosh, that's really, really, really helpful, Kirsty. I want to talk more about it, but it's 12:59.
Kirsty, have you got time for one question? Because what Tomac is on, and I'm hoping he's still there and he can ask his question if he wants, rather than me read it out.
Yeah, please put me on the spot. Let's go for it.
Well. Tomac, are you still there? Oh, I'll see.
Yes, sorry, I was just finding a place to be a bit more quiet. Hi, thanks for all of this. It's been really helpful. I was just wanting to ask, because I'm a mental health first aider, and so part of that is like strict confidentiality. Obviously, for an extreme situation, like someone saying they're you know, immediately planning suicide or some other form of harm, we have to contact emergency services. But I've always been a bit unsure where the line is when it comes to like family and emergency contacts. Like, obviously you'd want to tell them that something has happened, but how much is like safe and appropriate and caring to all the people in that situation?
Yeah, confidentiality is a really important question. Thank you for raising that, because we haven't talked about it. At work, if you're having a conversation as a line manager or as a colleague, then I guess that conversation with the individual, confidentiality can be discussed. Yeah, you can ask that individual, you can say, I'm really concerned about you. Can you give your permission for me to talk to your family? Would it be okay if I tell them what you've told me today? They may turn around and said, no, absolutely not. That gives you another lever to continue the conversation. So it really depends on the individual conversation itself. But if you think there is immediate harm, then, ethically you have a responsibility to break confidentiality for that. But otherwise, I'd ask the question, just say, I'm concerned. I feel like if your mum or your sister or your brother or your friend or your husband or whatever, if they knew this, I really feel that they'd be supportive. Could I contact them and ask the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Really
That makes
good
sense. Thank you.
question, Thomas. Thank you for that. We're at 1 o'clock and we're getting lots of really good feedback, which is really, really good. Kirsty, I think folk, if you want to find out more about Kirsty and what they do, Mind and Mission, Google Mind and Mission, and
mindandmission.com.
That's a good one to remember. Yep. And
yeah,
in terms
or contact
of
me, Kirsty at mindandmission.com. Any questions, and please remember the safeguarding as well. If anyone feels triggered after this through their own personal circumstances, please reach out. I'll be happy to have a conversation as well.
And that's a fantastic place to end. Kirsty, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's been really good.
It's been fantastic, and I'm getting the shivers now. And I wonder, this is probably something that we probably should do again. Given all of the interest that we've got and the engagement. So
yeah, it's gone really quickly. I think there's so much more we could talk about, isn't there?
I know, absolutely. So, Lindsay, do you want to finish it? I'm grabbing it back. Is there anything that you want to cover, Lindsay, as we go?
Just that there's lots of comments just saying thank you. It's been really useful. They'd love a part 2, somebody said, so thanks for that comment. Yeah, so I think we have to do it again, Kirsty, based on that.
Excellent.
Good, happy to.
So thank you, everybody. Hopefully see you again on one of our next, I think our next one is negotiation skills, isn't it? Somebody nod the head. Oh, there's Joanne back. Yep, negotiation skills. And we've got Malcolm Curry, who is was a full-time trade union rep, and he's fantastic with the negotiation side. I think, Kirsty, you know Malcolm as well.
Oh yeah, I'm coming to that one.
You're coming to that one, absolutely. There's a lot of stuff out there that HR people can't negotiate or don't know how to negotiate. And he's got a fantastic approach to it in terms of an interest-based negotiation. So I'm really looking forward to a conversation with Malcolm as well. So hopefully we'll see some of you guys at that. And thank you so much for coming. It's just been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Take care, everyone.